I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Well, Political Philosophy is a Maurin Academy podcast. Please check out the Maurin Academy in the notes below. I've got a link there. We do a lot of classes. We invite speakers. We have reading groups. We have a lot of opportunities for people to get involved. There's a diversity of content that we offer around the intersection of environment, politics, economics, religion. We have a particular point of view, but we are also a big tent, and there's a lot there for people to find and explore. So I encourage you to do that. It's one way to kind of like keep your self-education going, and to an extent with other people, I guess however much of an extent you want it to be with other people, because we have a growing community that you can interact with. So at any rate, today though, I wanted to get back into Emmanuel Mounier's The Personalist Manifesto. And in particular, I want to focus in on his chapter on capitalism as the enemy of the person. And as I mentioned last time, he does have a particular axe to grind regarding capitalism. We know this already, but in this chapter, there's some promise that we'll finally figure out exactly what it is about capitalism that bothers Mounier so much. Okay, so he starts off this chapter saying the extreme importance attaching today to the economic problem among human preoccupations is a sign of social disease. The economic organism underwent a sudden proliferation at the close of the 19th century, and like a cancer, it has upset or even eaten away the rest of the human organism. Wow, okay, like right off the bat, I've mentioned this before. Some people have had a hard time like understanding this, but I think when we see the use of terminology like social disease, cancer, human organism, I think we have to be careful, because even though Mounier doesn't mean it this way, probably, in fact, I'm sure he doesn't. Nevertheless, that kind of language can lead to people literally demonizing other people. It's a kind of language that could associate other people with capitalism, so that anybody who is perceived as a capitalist suddenly is not a human, but a disease or a cancer. So I don't like it. I wish he wouldn't do it. I think it's supposed to indicate just how strongly he feels about this and how upsetting it is to him to have kind of witnessed this transformation happen. If we sort of unpack it, he's saying that industrialization was quite a shock. It created what I would call homo economicus. That's what he's talking about there, the sort of reduction of the person to the person's economic existence. And then the development of this culture of economy where the first and only thing we often think about has to do with the economics, the economic obstacles, the economic opportunities, the economic constraints. And we come to see ourselves as more or less instruments of the economy, unable to, do differently than what the mechanism of the economy suggests must be done. Okay. So we're talking about, like ahead of his time, right? He's talking about capitalist realism, for instance. And to a certain extent, he's anticipating neoliberal ideology in the sense that as Wendy Brown says it. I've got a playlist on Wendy Brown's book, The Undoing of the Demos. She details how Homo economicus, that the ideology of economic man, pervades our entire culture, so that we see previously unaffected spheres of life like religion and human relationships, and education purely economically, purely in economic terms. So he's anticipating all that. So despite the fact that I don't particularly like the disease trope, I think, again, we see Mounier able to come up with a critique that is way ahead of his time. He's very prophetic in a way. He says, through lack of a reaction thereto or of a philosophy of life, the majority of critics and of men of action accepted the accident as the normal state of affairs. They proclaimed the primacy of economics over history and regulated their actions according to this primacy. So he, refuses to deal with capitalism, the advent of industrialization and capitalism, and the way that it actually proceeded as an absolute necessity, inevitable, couldn't be changed, couldn't be modified, couldn't have been done in a different way. That's what he means by, they accepted the accident as the normal state of affairs. And they proclaimed primacy of economics over history. So, that's the narrowing of the view to economics only, right? And turning around and saying history was driven by economics, and we were always kind of headed here, that sort of evolutionary view, right? That capitalism is the culmination of human progress, and there was no getting around it and no stopping it. Is to say that, other historical eras didn't really have their own essence. They didn't really have their own cultural truth, but rather they were sort of like intermediate steps on the way towards this. So he's disagreeing with that, and so he must be saying that along the way, people made decisions that ended up with the dark satanic mills and the abuse of laborers and the pollution of the landscape and all these things that he no doubt hates. But we could have done differently, because human beings are not simply tools of their economic evolution. Then he goes on to give more about what personalists ought to hold, right? Because this is the Personalist Manifesto. So he's laying it out there, and for you to accept or to reject. He says that personalists hold that human beings are not determined by their environment. They are conditioned by it. So he's saying right there, we still have free will. We are conditioned by it. There's a tendency to sort of be beaten down by it, especially in our times, when our technology and our organizations have become so big and so seemingly powerful that they seem determinative, but he's saying they're not. Okay, they're not determinative, but they exert a strong influence. So he says this tendency must be fought. So personalists are about fighting this conditioning. And he says there's a tendency for us to develop technocrats who view technique, and here he references Ellul in this book, Jacques Ellul. They tend to see technique as sort of a force in its own right, a determinative force, something that we have to conform to. And that tendency, that technocratic tendency, needs to be fought. He says clearly economics must be subordinated to the human, and therefore economics must be subordinated to politics. So that's a pretty philosophic statement. It's also pretty clear for a philosophic statement. He's saying that politics must basically regulate economics. Economics should not regulate politics and determine politics, which one might say is where we're at kind of in the 21st century, but rather the people, the political process which is a social process that should have to do more with values and culture, okay, and not simply with numbers and material growth. That's what he's saying, you know, and politics is in his view, it's got to be democratic somehow. He doesn't really lay out here exactly how, because of course, capitalism has developed under conditions of relative democracy. So he doesn't say here how he would modify it. We know he would reject going into the Soviet zone, in which at his time, you know, the communists were claiming that their organization was more democratic, even though people didn't really have a choice, and weren't like super active participants in their political system, but they claimed that they represented the will of the people. Clearly, Mounier doesn't want to go there. But exactly where he does want to go with this, I can't exactly tell. And maybe he's not saying because he knows he doesn't have a good, strong answer to that. He does distinguish himself in personalists from distributists. I don't believe he uses the term distributism. I don't remember running across the actual term distributism, but clearly he's aware of distributists and of kind of like the arts and crafts movement too, and they were kind of associated with each other. Distributists did want to return to a smaller stage of capitalism. They really didn't like the development of corporate capitalism, these big firms that, you know, outcompeted all the small ones and left most people without any property. Distributists like G.K. Chesterton here were about, you know, breaking up monopolies, using the political system to make sure that property was fairly evenly distributed, not perfectly, but, you know, where a lot of people could be property owners, either in farmland or in small businesses, so that people had proper freedom and could develop themselves and live more meaningful lives, getting meaning from their work and from their human relationships. So I think distributists would be closer to today's localists. And so you can also say that personalists like Mounier would not agree with our localists of today. They don't want to just return to smaller non-corporate capitalism. Now, he doesn't exactly say that he wants to eliminate property ownership. What he really seems to be talking about is he wants to really see the values associated with capitalist property ownership disappear in favor of higher, better values. So he says personalists do not believe in a pure capitalism, like libertarians might too, right? That if we only practice that capitalism, it would solve all of our problems. So he's just differentiating himself from, you know, people like today's libertarians who think that the problem is all the regulations and we just need to get government out of the way, and then competition would take care of the problems that we do have, and, you know, we'd get rid of government corruption, everything would be okay. Mounier says, well, our opposition to capitalism, personalists' opposition to capitalism, is radically at variance with all these half-hearted or these basically false criticisms. It does not arise out of any regret for the past, but only out of a desire to build a future with all the authentic acquisitions of the present. What he really means to say there, regret's kind of an unfortunate translation. What he really means to say is it does not come from nostalgia for the past, but out of a desire to build a future with all the authentic acquisitions of the present. So there he's saying in a fancy way, with all the things that capitalism has built up, okay? He doesn't want to return to arts and crafts. He doesn't even necessarily want to get rid of the satanic mills. He just wants to stop them from being satanic, okay? Trying to be blunt here. Hopefully it helps. He says capitalism was made possible because of a technical progress that was only incidentally linked to its juridical ideology and its ethics. I think I would question that, but not here, I guess. But like that's not a foregone conclusion. But anyway, like he is saying that um, liberal ideology and its ethics could be delinked from capitalism. Now, he would still have a problem with liberal ideology and its ethics because it has become too materialistic. But I sense that Mounier might be okay with keeping quite a bit of it, since it is fairly individualist, as long as it could be shaped into um, a more personalist direction. That is, there are elements of it having to do with human freedom and rights that I think that Mounier would want to keep. Okay. And what he wants to do too, not only to delink and keep some of what we've built up ideologically alongside capitalism, but he also wants to delink our technical progress or technique from capitalism, which puts him a little bit in the communist zone in the sense that they too wanted to do that. They wanted to take what capitalism had built up in its technology and its techniques for manufacturing and put them in the service of human flourishing. They just thought that human flourishing primarily took place at the material worldly level, right? And not at the level of like interior development, diverse cultural development, spirituality, and so forth. So he veers off into that territory, but he wants to distinguish himself from the Marxist position as well, right? So somehow we should get the fruits of both liberalism and even the technical fruits of capitalism without the downsides of capitalism in the way that it treats people, the way it sort of drags people down to the material level, organizes them like parts in a machine rather than trying to develop their personal interior life. Destroying their culture and so forth. So that's a lot. He's asking for a lot, but why not? Why not ask for a lot? He's looking at the potential that has been wrought by this huge, quote, accident of capitalist development. And like the Marxist, he's saying, well, what could we do with that? As opposed to what we are doing with it, which seems to be kind of bad. Okay, so I think it's reasonable, and he's trying his best to articulate, how to avoid the problems of Marxism, in his view, while actually taking some of the wisdom of the Marxist reaction to capitalism. So in that vein, he says that mass production isn't automatically bad and that handcrafted sort of arts and crafts type of work is not automatically good. And that there are ways that human labor can be organized in a mass production setting that would enrich the laborers instead of treating them like parts of the machine. So he wants to go into that zone of how can we still continue to produce things using our collective labor, or in these days, without, how can we organize our economy in a way that still has a lot of people in an office or at home working behind computers, but do that in a way that doesn't treat them like a part of the program, but like the creative, multidimensional beings that they are. Is there a way to reconcile these things so that we can still have the fruits of all of those developments and the fact that we do have to work in a fairly collectivized way in order to get these big things done without dehumanizing people? That's what he wants. And then he finally says, this is as far as I'm going to go this time, personalism, therefore, does not look for its economic structures to be to a pre-technical civilization, but to the future. And I just want to read you this full section here, because I think that it really exemplifies where he wants to go. He says, to enlarge and diversify technique to the stature of man, to liberate technique from the economic and social organization of capitalism, and to see finally that it neither absorbs nor deforms personal life. That is the only reasonable way to proceed, and to avoid both the utopias of reactionaries and the utopias of technocrats. One thing we are certain of, that the person is not a closed garden in which civilized man takes shelter from machine civilization, but a spiritual principle that must animate all civilization and raise civilization to its own spiritual level. It is for technicians who have the spiritual sense of the person to map out the road for this new technique. Today, we may well see that it will follow two main lines. First, it will enlarge the structure of which we have spoken above and coordinate organic and spiritual structures. And second, it will give a new direction to machine civilization and organization, a direction quite opposed to the present one, which makes for centralization, for industrial giantism, and for octopus-like cities. Okay, now notice here, the one thing I want to point out before going is that he says it is for technicians who have the spiritual sense of the person to map out the road for this new technique. I entirely agree with that. I would call on anybody, and we have a number of them active in the Maurin Academy, anybody who is involved on the technique side of our economy as a programmer, as a developer, as a person who's involved in dealing with cybersecurity, and all of those types of fields. Those people either need to also have a humanistic education, or they need to supply that humanistic education for themselves. Learn about philosophy, moral philosophy in particular. Deal with history and culture. We absolutely need them to do this, to make sure that we have leadership that is both technically competent and morally and ethically informed, culturally informed, politically informed. And that is possible. And without those types of people, I don't think we can do it. I don't think that we can modify our trajectory. Mackenzie Wark has voiced the same plea for the technical class to provide that leadership. I don't know if Mounier could have possibly anticipated where we're at now, but I feel like that sentiment is prophetic. And I think that it is no longer the case that the professor of philosophy is the most qualified on their own to make pronouncements about how to humanize the types of processes and structures that we have now in our economy and in our politics. People who are actually knowledgeable about technique and also about human beings are required, and a dialogue between those two types of persons is required to develop more people who can provide that leadership in the future. So I would call on people who are listening, if you're involved in the technical fields, I think it's your responsibility to also make sure that you are well educated in these other areas. Self-educated is great. And actually, the Maurin Academy is a pretty good place to do that. And we've had the pleasure of meeting quite a few people from those fields. So that being said, I will bid you adieu for this week, and thanks for listening. Bye.